In this video today, we read Flowers from 1970, a DreamNotFound fanfiction, and I cry over it. Here is part 1 of Flowers from 1970 by this wattpad creator. Go check out their account and go read the original story. And you should check out my Twitch channel and consider dropping a follow. It's free and each follow counts towards a new goal, so I hope to see you there. And if you're not already, subscribe to my YouTube channel, double check that you're subscribed. Enjoy the story, try not to cry too. George walked up to the steps of his house, keys in hands and a dark look on his face. The neighborhood had been quiet, except for the occasional passing car, which did not help his ongoing battle with isolation and loneliness. The quieter it was, the louder his thoughts were, and so he entered his empty home, which housed a quiet so large a drop of pin would be highly audible, his head filled with a mass of concepts. He trudged his way up to his room, carrying his jacket in hand as he threw the keys onto the desk and collapsed on his bed. While he waited, his mind the only thing keeping his company, and wasn't good company. He waited a while. His mind the only thing keeping him company, and it wasn't good company. All he had was regrets and scenarios of brighter futures if he had made better decisions in the past. Suddenly he heard a ring come from the other side of the room. It wasn't coming from his cell phone, but a vintage phone he found in his house when he first moved in. He'd spent a few weeks trying to repair it, but eventually gave up. But now it seemed to be fully operational. He ran to the phone. Hello? Hey Sap, can you believe Governor Schlatt had a heart attack and died today? That's insane. The man on the other end of the phone mumbled into the phone. I'm sorry, but you have the wrong number. Today? George asked, confused. Oh, well, sorry then. But yeah, today. It's all over the papers. George raised his brow. Are we talking about Governor Schlatt from Florida? Yeah, who else? The man answered, a shrug visible in his tone. Schlatt died over 50 years ago, though. George was convinced he was talking to either someone very uneducated or downright insane. The man laughed loudly. I don't know about you, but I don't remember Schlatt dying in 1920. Now, George knew the man couldn't do math. 50 years ago was not 1920. Everyone knows it happened in 1970. Then his right-hand man, Jack, was almost assassinated the next day. He did not know why he was so hell-bent on correcting a stranger, but he did so nonetheless. Jack? Everyone loves Jack. He's fine and giving a speech right now. Listen. The phone sounded like it was moving and then suddenly put up to radio. The radio was barely audible, but George could make out the words like, this is a tragic loss and such. It was definitely sounding like Jack. George figured he was talking to a crazy person and hung up. He walked over his bed, thought about the phone call for no more than 3 minutes before falling asleep. The next day, George brought a bowl of cereal to his room to eat. He seemed to stare at his cell phone, waiting for calls and texts. How are you? From people that seemed to never come. He booted up his computer to watch videos, and then suddenly the old telephone started ringing again. George hesitated for a bit. Did he really want to talk to a crazy person again? Then again, it wasn't like there was anyone else to talk to him. He sighed, then picked up the phone. Hello? How did you know? The same man said into the phone. What? About Jack. How someone was going to attempt to kill him today, he asked seriously. George rolled his eyes. I told you. Everyone in the state knows. We learned about it in school and everything. Didn't you? Also, why do you keep saying today? What's the date for you? The man asked George. July 28, 2020. No response, just heavy breathing that sounded like hyperventilating. After a while, the man spoke softly again. It's July 28, 1970 here. Now this was confirmation that whoever George was talking to was crazy. Look, if this is some kind of prank, I'm just gonna hang up. This isn't my phone, and I'm a sap or whoever that is. Wait, the man yelled. Do you live in 821 Manberg Street? George started freaking out. The man knew his address. He was gonna end the call and contact the police, or don't freak out. The man read his mind. That's my old house. Well, my old house for you, but I live there right now. Does the upstairs bedroom still have a hideous flower wallpaper? Yes, George answered hesitantly. That mean they haven't changed it since I lived there? Give me a sec. The man was silent for a while until George heard a clicking sound. It was a pen uncapping. What are you doing? Look in the corner of the wall, near the window, the man told him. Why? Just do it. George heard what sounded like scribbling on the other side of the phone. George hesitated but walked to the corner of the room. What am I supposed to be looking at? Suddenly, old worn-out pen marks started appearing in the wall slowly, like burning wood. Hi, it said. Do you see that? The man on the other side of the phone asked, before audibly capping his pen again. Yes. George was hyperventilating, clutching his chest. This surely was not possible. Who are you? Who are you? They asked at the same time, but the man answered first. My name's Dream. Dream? George raised a brow. It's a nickname. I don't want to give you my real name yet, since you could be the government spy or something. George chuckled. Well, I'm George. So tell me, George, who wins in the World Series next year? Asking for a friend. I'm afraid I can't tell you that, George responded. Well, technically I can, but morally it's pretty wrong. Darn, thought that was gonna work, Dream tisked. So tell me about the future. Wait, does that sound nerdy? Tell me about 2020. I can't tell you much, since isn't it science fiction common knowledge that telling someone of the past too much would mess up the future? George told Dream. I suppose you're right. Well, I know now that I moved out since you live in my house now. Who's Sap? My friend. We call him Sapnap. I'm guessing you have his telephone, but I don't know why I ended up there at my house. Really? That's what you're confused about? The whole talking to someone from a different time part? George mentioned. Okay, I'm confused too. It's like George could hear his eye roll. So, how old are you? 24. George didn't know why he was telling this to a stranger, but his loneliness and desperation got the best of him. I'm 21, Dream answered with no hesitation, and George only assumed that he was a confident sort of man. What do you do for a living? George let curiosity replace his anxiety over the magical phone. Dream chuckled. I coach baseball for little kids. I love baseball. What about you? Do I love baseball, or what I do for a living? Why not answer both? I've got time. George lied down on his bed and stared up at the ceiling. I'm not that into sports. Also, I program video games for computers for a living. What kind of job is that? George smiled. I forgot you probably don't know what those are yet. Yeah. Hello, I'm from the past, Dream joked. George laughed. Well, I have to go. I should get sleep. I should sleep. Boo, Dream groaned into the phone. As fun as it was to talk to Dream, it was getting late into the night and he had projects to finish. Goodbye, wrong number. Dream bid him goodbye. Goodbye, old man. Hey, I'm not old yet, Dream laughed before hanging up. It had been a week since Dream and George had finished talking, and needless to say, they'd become good friends. George had started eating lunch up in his room, awaiting a phone call around the same time every day, and again with dinner at night. They talked about anything and everything, including their childhoods and their favorite things from their time. Dream had made George promise not to look for him in 2020, or try to Google him, whatever that was. So George kept his promise, and they continued to speak as if the only distance between them was miles and not time. It's weird. We can't physically communicate. I mean, we can, but I'm assuming you're old. I have an idea, Dreams. After a while, he left the phone on his dresser and told George he'd be back. George waited patiently, counting the many flowers on his wall, when he heard a faint voice come from the phone again. What's your idea? George asked, turning to his side on the pillow. Go to the wall next to the window, Dream urged George. George groaned, indicating his tiredness, but Dream insisted he go. Grudgingly, he got up and walked to the wall next to the window, as Dream told him. Now what? Dream stood by the window. The walls where he was, in time, were much newer and intact than George. He'd come from the shed with a bucket of lime green paint. He pinned the phone between his cheeks and shoulder and opened the paint can. Dream, what are you doing? Just look at the wall, Dream said as he took a brush and applied a thin coat of paint on his hand. Ready? Dream said into the phone. George sighed. Yes, though I don't exactly know what I'm ready for. George waited at the wall, whistling. Suddenly, lime paint started appearing on the wall. It was appearing slowly, and a bit chipped and worn out, but there nonetheless. George, are you there? I hope you see it and no one erased it after I moved out. Dream talked to the phone. It was a handprint. A seemingly former lime green handprint. My goodness. It was darker and faint now. George stayed silent and absent-mindedly put his own hand over the handprint. Dream's hand was bigger than his, with slightly longer fingers. George, Dream called out, and George pulled his hand away quickly. Yeah, I see it. Did you hold my hand? What? George choked out, but Dream started laughing. Calm down, I'm kidding. George could hear his smile. I wonder what else we could try now. George sat down on his bed, still looking at the paint handprint. I wonder why you never visited. What? Dream questioned. Why future you hasn't visited me yet since we started talking? Like why you never came on July 29th to tell me you're who I'm talking to? George pondered curiously. Maybe I'm dead, Dream said half-jokingly. George hated that thought. It was possible. He fought back the urge to Google him and find out everything he could about Dream. But the only information he had was that he lived here before, and Dream didn't want George to go looking for him. They bid each other good night, and George fell asleep on his side, staring at the green handprint at the wall. Dream and George found other ways to communicate, with George having the brilliant idea of Dream leaving a time capsule buried somewhere in the backyard for George to find. George uploaded his work project on a computer and walked outside with a shovel he'd recently purchased. Dream had told him it was in the corner near the fence and had hoped no one had taken it out since it was put in there. With that information, George started to dig. He wasn't the strongest physically, but persisted with each stab of the shovel into the cold dirt. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw someone looking at him. It must have been weird to be digging a hole in your own backyard. He must have been looked like he was digging a grave to dump a body in. George shrugged at the man, which prompted him to walk away. The man looked quickly into a pocket notebook while he was walking away and wrote something down. George was scared it was notes about him being suspicious that he was going to report to the police. It had been over 15 minutes and George sighed. He took a look at the pile of dirt on the ground and shook his head. Someone must have found the capsule before him. He was about to shovel the dirt he worked so hard on digging back to the hole when a glimmer of light reached his eyes. There, buried into the ground, was a hint of metal. George's eyes widened as he ran for the shovel again, peeking at the ground until he found a pill-shaped metal container. It had masking tape on it with the words George written in it. He did not even bother shoveling the dirt back in. He ran back home to rinse off the outside container, then shuffled to his room. Right on time, the phone started ringing. George picked it up. Dream, I've got your capsule. Dream chuckled. So you do. I'll open it. Curious how long things in there survived. It took George a while, as the rust created a sort of lock between the seams, but eventually it popped open with such force that George was thrown back a little with a groan. You alright? Dream asked worriedly into the phone. George got back up. Yes, just fine. Just a couple things inside the capsule, scattered around the floor, due to have open. George grabbed the first thing he saw. He squinted at it. Ho-chew, he tried to read in the wrapping. Yes, I love those, Dream said excitingly. What is it? He held it up to his nose and sniffed it. It smelled like rotten candy. It's gum. Check the expiration date. The wrapper had a barely visible blob of ink that represented the expiration date. August 22nd, 1971, George read aloud. Can't believe this thing never attracted ants. George put the candy on his desk and reached for something else on the floor. It was a rock. It's a quartz. Yeah, it's my favorite one I own. George held it tightly in his hand. Why give it to me then? Dream laid on his bed, letting his records play in the background, staring at the wallpaper. Why give it to me then? How was Dream going to answer that? He gave it to George because he wanted his favorite person to have his favorite thing. But all of it was so wrong. He cared about someone who didn't even exist yet. He cared about his best friend Sapnap, too, but not in the way he did for George. Someone he'd never even met. George mumbled into his phone. Yeah, I guess I just don't think I'll need it in the future, he answered untruthfully. Alright. George sounded like he was scrambling to pick up some more items. In the capsule, there were other little things, such as an old music cassette and baseball cards. After a while, George saw a little canister and held it up to his eyes. Then he opened it. It was dry, crackling, and expired, formerly lime paint, that was now a dark forestly green. What did you open? Dream asked quietly. Green paint. George dipped his finger in, and what he saw surprised him. His finger broke into the hard, cracked layer into a watery, preserved lime paint that he was sure was the original color. I'm sure it's ugly now, right? Dream joked, but George looked at his finger covered in paint. No, it's perfect. George had an idea. He spilled a good portion of the can to his hand and spread it around with his fingers. Are you there? What are you doing? Dream asked, but George walked to his bedroom wall. He glanced at Dream's handprint, and with one movement placed his paint-covered hand right next to it. The size difference of their hands were interesting, along with the detail that Dream's handprint was old and crackling, while George's was clean and fresh, and still a bright color. George grabbed the phone with a clean hand. Yeah, I'm here. What did you do? George stared at the two handprints. Nothing, he mumbled. Oh, Dream murmured. Well, there's one more thing in there. Taped inside the capsule. You can look at it, but I'll have to hang up. Why? George asked. Bye, George. Have a good night. Dream bid. Before George could ask for an explanation once again, their connection cut. George put down the phone in a sigh and checked the inside of the capsule. Inside of a piece of paper. A Polaroid. It was Dream. It seemed candid, taken by another person. He was smiling with beautiful, dirty blonde hair and a tall stature. He was holding a pet cat and was in the very bedroom George was in at the moment. George thought he was quite handsome. He was getting sleepy and his eyes felt closed with the photo held close to him. 1.6. George was sitting at his computer, finishing up work he had been too caught up talking to Dream to remember doing so. Every time he opened his computer, he always had to resist the urge to search Google endlessly for Dream. But a promise not to go looking for him was more important than curiosity. He was rushing his project, waiting for the phone to ring. This has become a daily thing, procrastinating and laying in his bed with the phone waiting next to him for a call from a boy he's never met in person. Shut now, True. The magic and impossibility of the whole thing had passed. His interest in Dream in his life had made him forget how absurd the whole thing sounded. It made him forget how far away in time Dream was. Maybe it was the fact that he'd been lonely. His family had been back in England, and he had lived alone for the past 6 years, having 1 or 2 friends who he had not even talked to in months each. Start with your reading level. Very poor, actually. My reading level is not that great. Sometimes when you're lonely, you cling to the one person who makes you feel like you have everybody in the world. For George, that was Dream. Dream asked him things no one had even bothered to ask. From simple things like how his day was, to unique questions like what would take him if he had 60 seconds to gather things up to go into a bomb shelter. He didn't know the last time someone had ever been that interested in him and had asked him to say, "What?" He couldn't remember when he had the last heard himself talk about things that he actually liked to talk about. So yes, despite the time difference, no kidding, there was a connection there that mattered to him, the first connection he had in a while. As he submit his day's work of coding, he absently-minded walked over to the wall. He didn't know how many times he looked at it a day, from the high to the corner of the room, to the 2 handprints made with the same paint at different times, knowing there was something to prove to the boy that he talked to existed to make him feel calm when the world felt like it was crumbling. The photo of Dream laid on his desk, his smile permanently captured to the piece of the film that had survived 50 feet under the dirt, furthermore presenting the fact that Dream was real. So he clutched to the phone in his hand, still vaguely stained with paint, waiting for a call. He did not see it as wasting time. He saw it as an opportunity to finally speak to someone who cares about him. Just on time, the phone started to ring, and he picked it up quickly. George glanced over to the corner of the room and laid on his desk. "Yes, I did. That's you, right?" "Yes," Dream sighed, as he seemingly slumped into his chair. "My friend Sap took it. The cat is my cat Patches." "When you called this phone, it's because you thought it was Sap, right?" George asked curiously. "Yeah, this is his number," Dream answered. "He doesn't know I talk to you, though. I think he'd see me as crazy." George chuckled. You're already crazy." Thank you, thank you." Dream gave him short laughs. "So, I thought about the science of it all," said after he gathered himself. George raised his eyebrows. "The science? Is this even science? This is straight sci-fi magic. But if all of our experiments with the time capsule and the paint worked out, it means that I do exist in your so-called timeline." Dream began. "Go on." George was intrigued. "That should mean that before our first phone call, I never knew you existed, but after we started talking, I think we may have modified the memory of Dream and your time, and adding in the events that we create." "So," George began, "why hasn't old you ever visited me yet? Like I said, I could be dead, or gotten Alzheimer's, or just refuse to see you for a reason I don't know yet. Do you have a Halloween costume picked out yet?" No. What do you want me to be for Halloween?" "Why don't you look me up on the internet then?" "Why don't you let me look you up on the internet then?" George asked. Dream knew about the internet, as George had spent hours trying to explain the concept to him. Dream struggled. "I don't know. I guess I like the idea that we're talking as if this whole 50-year gap doesn't exist. It's weird to think that I'm an old man in your time, and that we're so far apart from each other. You finding out about old me just proves that this friendship would never be a normal one." Dream had done his best to explain. "I understand and feel the same way," George says quietly. "Thank you. Also, thank you for keeping your promise." "Of course, any time." George smiled and looked at the clock. "I should sleep. It's late and I have a meeting with some colleagues early in the morning tomorrow." "Have fun with that," Dream chuckled. "Good night, wrong number." It's been a week. At that moment, Dream had been on the phone with George, talking about their favorite things of certain categories. George mumbled. "Favorite animal?" Dream got up and walked over to the small pet bed on the floor and picked up his cat Patches. "Cats. Say hi, Patches." He put the phone up to catch his nose. Obviously, she was in no mood to say hi to anyone. "She's moody." George smiled. "Did you wake her up forcefully?" Dream put Patches back on her bed. No comment. George shook his head with a laugh. "I like cats too. I used to have one. Cat people are the best, true," Dream said, and George hummed in agreement. "What haven't we asked?" George wondered aloud after a few moments of silence. Dream was looking outside the window when he saw a man pull up in the neighbor's driveway. His neighbor came out and she smiled at the man, who presented her with the brightest and fullest of red roses. She happily took them from him and gave him a hug, picked her up and spun her. Dream immediately assumed these were people who had not seen each other meeting for the first time again. These kind of moments made Dream slightly jealous. He'd never had a serious romantic connections, other than the occasional one-time date that usually ended in disaster. He would have loved to be the one bringing someone flowers. "Dream, you're quiet, but I feel like I can hear your thoughts," George said after a while, snapping Dream out of his head. Sorry, Dream apologized, but I just thought of a question. George Tun, what is it? What's your favorite flower? Dream could not handle watching the happy couple any longer, so he shut his blinds and covered his windows with the white curtain. I don't know much about flowers, but I do admire orchids or calendulas. Dream knew exactly what those flowers were. As he helped his mother in her flower shop for years, he knew his flowers and he knew how to take care of them, and he loved them very much. He thought about George's answer. Any particular reason? Well, orchids were my mother's wedding flowers. They were everywhere, apparently, George explained. As for calendulas, they're just quite beautiful. Cool. Now I know what flowers to send you, Dream half joked. How would that work? George asked curiously. I've given you items before. Flowers from 1970 couldn't survive 50 years in a time capsule, Dream. Dream sighed. Well, I know that, he said against the wall. I'll figure it out. Dream would be nearly in his 70s if he was still alive during George's time. That physically hurt him to think about, but he was still brainstorming ways to get flowers to 2020. He came up with an idea. George, I have to get stuff from the store, but I'll call you again tonight. There was a small scuffle from George's end before he responded with a talk to you later, and they both hung up. Dream drove his car to the nearest flower shop. It was near his house, and it was squished between a nightclub and a bookstore. He walked in. The smell of fresh flowers overwhelmed him, but it was clean and new. The door also rang a few bells when it opened, which he found cool. Welcome. The man running the store greeted him, wearing an apron and tending to some plants hanging to the ceiling. Need anything specific, sir? Dream walked over to him. Actually, I do. Do you sell seeds by any chance? The man stepped down from the small staircase ladder, and he gave him a goofy smile. As a matter of fact, I do. Follow me. The man stepped down from the small staircase ladder and gave him a goofy smile. As a matter of fact, we do. Follow me. Jim followed the man over to the back where the seeds and various gardening supplies were kept, or organized alphabetically in these little drawers, the shopkeeper explained. I'll be tending to those plants outside, but if you need any help finding anything in particular, just give me a shout or come find me. He grinned again before walking back to where he was working earlier. Dream laughed as he shook his head as he walked away, amused by the young man's energy. He then walked to the drawers and looked for orchid seeds, but couldn't find any. Dream was too shy to call the man over so quickly after he just walked away, so in the meantime he went over to find calendula seeds. To his luck, he opened the drawer and found one last packet of calendula seeds. He took them and walked over to the shopkeeper. Excuse me, Dream looked up, because the man was so high on the ladder, snipping little leaves of plants. The man looked down. Hello, did you find what you need? Dream nodded. Yes, but do you have orchid seeds by any chance? The man frowned. No, actually. They take years to grow properly from a seed. We just can't get our hands on them to stalk. Dream gestured his understanding. That's alright, he smiled. I'll just be taking these then. He shook the seeds to show him. Calendulas, pot marigolds. Very pretty when they're grown. He stepped down from the staircase ladder once again and led him to the counter. Yes, Dream agreed. To the person I'm getting them for thinks so too. Oh, so you got a girl that loves to garden then? Dream chuckled at the innocent question. It's a bit complicated. It always is, the shopkeeper agreed. My little lady hates flowers, so it's complicated for me too. Who could hate flowers? Her, apparently. She's allergic. He grinned nonchalantly before handing Dream the seed packet and taking the money. Dream smiled back. Thank you, He squinted at the name tag in the man's apron. Carl. You're welcome, sir. He waved goodbye happily before going back to taking his plants. Dream went home and packed the seeds into a time capsule and buried them in the usual spot he put them, then called George, notifying him that he indeed figured out a way to get him flowers from 1970. George held the 50-year-old seed packet in one hand and the phone in the other. Dream, I've got no idea how to grow flowers, and I don't have any supplies. You don't have to grow them. You can just keep the seeds and say they're flowers, because technically they are. George shook his head. No, you went through the trouble. The least I can do is grow them. Plus, I need a new hobby again anyways, and gardening seems like a fun thing to try. I left a little list of things you need and some tips in the container, Dream reminded him. George picked up the capsule, and indeed, there was a small paper with chicken scratch-like handwriting. Nice handwriting. Oh, shush. I never was one for good penmanship. George read over the paper. If you don't mind, be off now to get supplies before it gets too dark. Dream sighed in defeat. He felt a little selfish for always wanting to be the person George spent his time with, but he understood he had a life. Alright, he said. Can I call you later? Not sure, but I can definitely try, George said as he put on a jacket and grabbing his car keys. Goodbye for now then, George, Dream said over the phone. Goodbye, Dream, George responded before putting the phone down and walking out of his house into his car. He sat on the driver's seat and put his cell phone on the phone holder. Hey Siri, the phone beeped. Directions to the nearest grocery store. The phone took a moment before it spoke. Alright, I found a gardening store near you. The first store was only half a mile away. It was awful close, so he chose it and pulled pulled out of his driveway. George got to the gardening store, which was a bit run down from the outside. When he walked in, it was clean and nice and beautiful place. He looked around, unsure where to look, when the old man who was watering a row of soil turned to him. "Why, hello," he smiled happily. "Anything I can do for you, sir?" George took out a piece of paper with Dream's list of supplies, but he realized he left it at home. "You alright, sir? Do you know how to help me get when I need to grow a certain type of flower?" George asked politely. "Do I?" The old man put his fist on his hip like a superhero, and George was surprised how he could still be so energetic in his old age. "Why, I'm probably the best in town to help you with that, young lad. What are you growing?" "Calendulas." George showed him the seed packet. The old man looked at the brand and label closely. "Why, this here is one of our seed packets. We haven't had these flowers in stock since the old 70. How'd you get your hands on one of these?" George scratched the back of his head, found him in an old drawer. The man looked at him skeptically. "Well, I can go get what you need myself while you wait here. Look around if you'd like." George raised his eyebrow. "Oh, I can help if you'd like," he'd offer, but the shopkeeper shook his head furiously. No, I haven't helped a customer like you in months, maybe years. Let me feel like I'm doing my job again," he assured. George became sad at how the man's business was seemingly slow and dry, and agreed to let the man help get the supplies for him. After a surprisingly fast few minutes, the man came back with basic supplies he'd need to grow flowers. George followed him over to the counter. "Thank you." "Problem. So, why the interest in beginning gardening?" the old man asked, while placing his items in a tote. George thought about it for a while. "Just want to see if these old flowers have any hope in growing. You'll need a lot of love and patience if you want to see a leaf come out of the dirt from flowers from 1970 something," he told George before telling him the total price of items, which was cheap. George took a $100 bill. "Keep the change," he smiled. The old man's eyes widened. "Why, thank you. You're lucky to be able to grow flowers at home. I can't." "Why is that?" George asked as he took the tote of items. "My wife hates most flowers," he answered plainly. "Hates them? Who could hate flowers, though?" George wondered aloud. The man smiled. "Her, since she's allergic." George was taken aback. "A flower store owner whose wife is allergic to flowers. Wow, that must be complicated then." "It always is," said the man with a big smile. "We've lasted over 50 years, so I guess it hasn't been that complicated," he assured happily, and then suddenly shivered. "Are you right, sir?" George asked. "Oh, why, yes," he smiled goofily. "Just got a weird sense of deja vu. Anyways, my name is Carl. If you need anything, you're always welcome, whenever you'd like." George chuckled. "I'll be sure to turn to you, Carl. Thank you." George got home and placed his stuff on the bedroom floor. He looked through the items and grabbed a piece of paper with Dream's instructions he had left on his desk. The phone rang and George rushed to answer it. "Hello, Dream. I just got supplies." "That's good. Will you start growing the flowers soon?" he asked. George organized his new items. "I should be, if not busy at any time soon." "Good," Dream audibly smiled. "It's a funny story. I met the cheeriest old man I could ever meet." "Wasn't me," Dream joked. George rolled his eyes. "No, it was the man who owned the flower shop." "Bummer it wasn't me," he said lightheartedly. "Anyways, why was he funny?" George sat down at the side of the bed, taking off his jacket. "He owns a flower shop, but his wife's allergic to flowers." The phone went silent. "Dream?" "No way," he shouted. "What is it? What's his name?" "Carl," the Dream asked excitedly. George's eyes widened. "Yeah, you know him?" "He's who I brought the seeds from, George. That means we've officially been connected through one person." "Oh, that makes sense, since he hasn't sold calendula seeds since 1970. "Oh goodness, this is so weird," he shook his head. "Weird? It's absolutely awesome," Dream explained. It's great, and surprisingly, he still is with the lady allergic to flowers." George thought for a second. "Wait, so," he thought more. "Isn't it interesting how we both talked to Carl in the last 2 days, but in reality, us meeting him is 50 years apart?" Dream sighed when he heard 50 years apart, but hummed in agreement. "Anyways, I'll get to sleep so I can spend the morning trying to grow these flowers." Dream smiled. "Alright then. Good night, wrong number." "Sleep well, old man, who technically isn't old yet." Dream smiled before hanging up the phone and lying on his bed, staring at the ceiling until he eventually drifted off to sleep. George was thankful for living in 2020, the age of the internet where if you had no idea how to do something, with one click of a button, you could after 10 minutes. Though George had this advantage, he himself was a problem. He had watched different tutorials, but he was still confused. Stump supremacy. If Chump's not streaming after, we can give Chump a call. Maybe, chat. Guessing to say Chump is Robin. Your heart. Do not tell that to Chump. No. Yes, please. Okay. Alright, we'll see. We'll see. If Trump's up to being on a stream. He was visible to cars passing by and must have looked absolutely stupid. He groaned and put his hand through his hair, planting flowers. Could not possibly be that hard. Hey guys, we should totally do not tell Trump. How does Carl do this? George whispered aggressively to himself before crumbling onto the hard dirt. The man who'd watched him dig up the time capsule was once again writing furiously in the pocket notebook before spotting George and walking towards him. George started to panic. Why was the stranger walking towards him? Who was he? He didn't have to think before the stranger appeared in front of him. He pulled down his hoodie to reveal a young man with a beanie and a circular old rimmed glasses. You look like you're struggling. May I help? George watched him suspiciously, wondering why a passerby would help someone like him with such a seemingly easy talk like planting flowers. I don't know how to do this. The man knelt down in front of the plant pot. I'm Wilbur, Wilbur Soot. Live a couple houses down with my young son. George was a bit more relieved when he learned the man was the father, George Davidson. They shook hands. How old's your son? Wilbur gestured over to a line of trees which a boy and his friend were sword fighting. The blond one's mine. He's 6. George watched the 2 young boys play. He took my video disc game and broke it. The disc was important to me, one of them said as he slashed his foam sword towards the smaller brunette friend. The poor friend cowered slightly and swung the sword nonetheless. It's just a disc, Tommy, he said in a high-pitched voice, but Tommy was not giving in. He kept going at it, which highly amused George. Tommy, the woman in a soft voice called him. Play nice, please. She seemed used to yelling at him for that reason. But he took my... Tommy began to sputter, but was interrupted immediately. It's a disc, Tommy, the woman told him. We can get another one easily. Tommy shook his head angrily. It won't be the same, he complained, and his brunette friend rolled his eyes before dodging another sword hit. They seemed close, George told Wilbur, and Wilbur nodded with a smile. Practically had been friends since birth. Wilbur seemed experienced with planting flowers, expertly burying the seed and watering it as though he's done it many times in the past. Thank you. George sent a small smile to Wilbur. I assume it's not that hard. I'm just extremely dense. No prob, Wilbur began, but his son ran towards him suddenly, tears in his eyes. Daddy, he's here again, the boy sobbed, collapsing to his father's arms. Who's here, Tommy? Wilbur comforted the young boy. Uncle! Tommy cried into Wilbur's chest, pointing to his far left. Wilbur looked at George apologetically. He's afraid of his uncle. George was about to ask why, when suddenly a man of a tall stature, boots, with hair with pink highlights, shouted, Where is Theseus? George understood why Tommy found him intimidating. He was terrifying, and his voice boomed across the neighborhood. Our little someone is fighting people for a disc. If that's you, come here and fight me to death, his uncle shouted before spotting Tommy. Was it you? No, Tommy whimpered, but Techno moved closer, not believing his lie. Okay, I'm sorry, Uncle Techno. Wilbur looked to the blonde woman. Did you call him Sally? Sally gave him an apologetic look. He was mean to Tubbo, and this was the only way to stop him. Uncle Techno grabbed his sword from Tubbo and marched towards Tommy. I'll show you what fighting for possessions looks like. Ah! Tommy ran past Techno, who attempted to grab him was too slippery. He made a beeline for Tubbo. I'm sorry, Tubbo. Is Tubbo's real name? George asked Wilbur. No, Wilbur explained. It's a nickname everyone calls the kid. George nodded understandingly and looked over to the 2 playing kids. Tommy smiled. It's all right, Tommy, he said before giving his friend a hug. All was well. That was easier than I thought, Techno shrugged as he watched the boys embrace. Bummer. I thought I'd actually get to fight a child. He threw the sword down before walking away. George laughed during the whole situation. They seemed like a happy family. A sting of jealousy filled inside him. From seeing Tommy play with a friend to Wilbur and Sally's hilarious panning style, he wished he had grown up like that. Well, I should go, Wilbur told George. My father's coming tonight for a big dinner. He hasn't done that in a while, so it's quite a big deal. George grinned. Nice meeting you and your family, Wilbur. He got up and brushed the dirt off his jeans. I hope we talk again. Wilbur yelled for Tommy. So do I. Have a nice day. He walked towards his son, picking him up, urging Tubbo to follow so he could get back home to his family safe and sound. Dream called George to check up on him. Took a few rings before he picked up. Hello, Dream. George, he smiled. Sorry I couldn't call yesterday. The kids I coached were having a game, and it was quite busy. George was confused when he remembered Dream was coached baseball. How was it? Did you win? Dream gave a hearty laugh. In all honesty, it was a really bad loss, he admitted. They're quite young and didn't take it well. One of them threw soda on the player from the other team, and it caused some trouble between me and the parents. George imagined Dream trying to explain himself to a parent, and guiltily it amused him. How did that go? Dream groaned. They threatened to get me fired, accused me of being the one to tell the kid to throw the soda. I was getting riled up when one of the players came up to me and told me the kid was provoked to throw soda because the rival team called him a duck-footed and threw peanuts at him. George laughed, opening the microwave and throwing a bag of instant popcorn inside. What did they do to the rival team? Dream sighed. Nothing. They didn't get in trouble at all, but my kid got suspension from games. That's quite unfair, George frowned, leaning against the kitchen counter while playing with his fingernails. Dream was silent for a while. Yeah, but I'm going to work with him privately anyway, so he gets practice and isn't just thrown into the game next game when he's back. George smiled. He seemed to really care for the kids in the team, which reminded him of his run-in with Wilbur and his family the day before. That's sweet of you, Dream. I actually had a hilarious encounter with children as well. Oh, really? Dream sounded intrigued. What happened? The microwave beeped, and George put the phone between his cheek and shoulder as he opened it and made to grab popcorn inside. While I was having trouble planting your flowers in, ow, he burned his fingers, decided it was easier to grab it by pinching the corners of the bag instead. A man named Wilbur came over to help me, then I met his family. Wilbur, Dream thought. That's quite a nice name. He wrote it down on a sticky note before turning his lips to the phone again. What happened to his family? George chuckled at the memory. His kid was hilarious. He was fighting his friend over a video game disc, so Wilbur's wife called his uncle to scare him into apologizing. What an interesting way to parent, Dream grinned. Did it work? The boy sobbed and practically begged for forgiveness. George laughed before eating some popcorn and collapsing on the couch. You chew quite loud, Dream told George, and George immediately stopped, amusing Dream even more. George swallowed. I'm sorry, I forgot how loud it would sound over the phone. Dream shook his head. No, it's adorable, he said, sort of impulsively, but truthful nonetheless. George was taken aback by that. I imagined it being a bit annoying, but thank you anyways, was all he could say. I never asked you about this, George, Dream began, but you're obviously British. How'd you end up in Florida? George's first thoughts were ironic. From African. Have you from Africa? Why you white? A line from Mean Girls. But knew Dream wouldn't get the reference, so he kept it to himself. I got a scholarship from school here, George explained. I took it and got carried away with how much I liked it here. My mom and sister didn't want me to leave, but I did so anyways. I finished school and didn't come back home. I stayed with my school friend Alex, but he ended up moving to Mexico. Luckily, I had a job by then and could pay for this house. Now I'm here. He took in what he said, realizing that his loneliness had one person to blame, himself. Do you visit home that often? Dream asked, his voice full of genuine interest. George sighed. No, he replied. I send cards for holidays and birthdays, but the last time I saw them was when I had the argument about living here. They never made any effort to invite me back home anyways, so I never tried. You should try, Dream urged. They want you to stay home they wanted you to stay home in the first place, so why wouldn't they want you there? At least go check up on them. George had never thought about coming home until Dream had suggested he do so. He missed his family and grew up in a loving environment. It was him that isolated himself from his own worries for his future and hard work that had cost him his childhood full of friends and connections. It was easy for him to get caught up in work. All he did before he met Dream was work. He'd order takeout and stay in his house, burning his corneas with massive screen time just doing work. Meeting Dream had pulled him out of his mundane routine of not living, but merely surviving. He had a reason to get off his computer, and for the first time in a long time, he had someone to talk to. He'd gone inside, realizing how it had been since he had done everything physically draining when he dug up the time capsule. He'd driven to the flower store and met someone new. He'd gone outside and spent time trying to plant flowers he didn't know how to plant, resulting in making a new friend. Dream was the first domino in him living the way he should have been living life, all of his life, and all he was a voice on the phone. George, I'm sorry if it sounded like I'm forcing you to go back home. I know nothing about your situation, Dream said after a while. George felt bad for leaving him in silence while he was busy with his thoughts. George shook his head profusely. No, he assured. I was just thinking. About me? Dream joked. George smiled. His smile had reached his eyes, which since meeting Dream had started happening more often. Oh yes, of course, because I just can't stop thinking about you, he responded sarcastically with an eye roll. Honesty is the best policy, Dream said matter-of-factly. You're such... George couldn't even find the words. He just spoke with one of the first ones that came to his mind. A piece of work. Dream responded with sassy mumbles, which George found so vexing in a good way. George, what do you look like? Dream asked. George knew what Dream looked like, but realizing there was no way to show Dream his appearance. I can describe myself if you'd like. Yes, Dream agreed. Oh, how about this? You describe yourself, and I sketch it on the wall. You watch the sketch and tell me how accurate I am. I love how we normalize ruining the walls. Oh, shut up, Dream countered. So, deal? Alright, Dream, George came in. I guess I can clean the walls later. Dream celebrated. Just a warning, I'm an amazing artist. Dream groaned before speaking. Well, I have quite a long face, but I guess it evens itself out. I mean, I think my jawline does it justice. George watched and waited as the outline of a face started to appear on the wall. It cracked and worn with time, but still distinguishable. I have dark hair. It's straight and short cut at the moment, sort of bangs, but not too long. He looked at his reflection on his locked cell phone, trying his best to describe himself accurately. He watched the drawing. Oh, a bit longer than that, he instructed, and indeed the sketch of the hair became a bit longer. George expected Dream to do rushed joke drawing, but surprisingly it had full effort put in. Tell me about your eyes, Dream said. My eyes, George asked for a moment. They're pretty almond-shaped, and my pupils are quite large, so they look silly when I look to the side. Oh, and they're brown, I believe. Dream started a sketch of the eyes. They looked a bit bigger than his, but other than that, they still looked good. My eyebrows, I wouldn't say they're thick. They're not extremely thin either. They're a bit lower and closer to my eyes, George continued, and so did the drawing. I have no idea how to describe my nose, so I guess I'll just say medium. Medium, Dream chuckled. Yes, George confirmed. The nose could have used some work, but it didn't make the drawing look too bad. And your lips, George? Dream asked, almost softly. Describe your lips. They're the last thing. George thought about it for a while. They're full enough so they don't disappear when I grin, was the only thing he could explain. The drawing was complete. So, how is it? George was a bit amazed, to be honest. It's great. If you put me in a line with people and show to a stranger this drawing, and ask them to choose which one of us is was it, they'd pick me. Dream sounded proud of himself after that. Wow, so I'm a great artist. I was just joking about that. It's not entirely accurate, but that's on me for not explaining well enough, George critiqued. Maybe the drawing isn't that good, but I did picture you in my imagination. I hope that's more accurate since I tried to match a face to your voice, Dream told him. You're lucky you have a photo of me. I am, George said quietly. He meant to say it to himself, but obviously that didn't happen. Dream laughed. Damn, right you are. I'm a pretty thing to look at, aren't I? You're so full of yourself sometimes, George said. But on the inside, he deeply agreed. I get that a lot, Dream admitted proudly. Anyways, I'm going to turn in for the night. I have to meet up with my sister to help her with her dumb project, then drive her and my mom's place is quite far, so I'm waking up early. Are you staying there? George asked. Most likely, Dream sighed. Sorry I won't be able to call for the day. I'm sure the day after tomorrow I'm all yours. George smiled. Alright, be safe, Dream. Good night, George, Dream bid him, running his fingers on the wall, the sketch of George's face.